It's well known that the Japanese have infamously cemented their place in the history books as having some of, if not the most depraved and callous treatment of prisoners of war ever seen by man. Living in cramped, diseased conditions, forced to work hard labor, being beaten regularly, and given barely enough food for a 5-year-old were all par the course of the average prisoner of war. But the intriguing question of today's video is how the Japanese would react when they captured one of their own. With all the indiscriminate torture and despair the Japanese Empire enforced onto regular POWs, it's only natural to think that when finding one of their own, fighting for their enemies, the consequences would only be that much worse. Now, before we get into this topic, it's worth noting that the American army wasn't stupid enough to let Japanese American soldiers fight in the Pacific Theater. They had the exact same thoughts and figured they would die a brutal death if captured. With that said, although the Americans try to minimize the risk of Japanese Americans coming into contact with the Japanese army, there were a couple who slipped through the cracks and actually served in combat units in the Pacific Theater. It's important to make the distinction of serving in an actual combat unit, as there were over 6,000 Japanese Americans sent to the Pacific Theater. However, these men all served in US intelligence, far away from the front lines, and thus negating the danger of them being captured. As stated before, however, there were a handful of Japanese Americans that slipped past the watchful eye of the US military and weren't identified as Japanese, mainly because the places they lived, like Texas and Nebraska, were extremely sparse when it came to Asians, and the recruiters and sergeants didn't actually think they were of Asian descent. One of the only Japanese Americans captured in the Pacific was Frank Fujita, and funnily enough, the Japanese captors themselves didn't even realize he was Japanese until a year after his capture. Instead of evoking anger and hatred from Japanese guards, it is said they defaulted more toward the side of curiosity. Many of them asked him questions and were intrigued why a man of Japanese blood would fight for the enemy. They also tried to convert him to the Japanese cause, however he resisted throughout several interrogations by pretending to be stupid and refusing to learn Japanese. Surprisingly, the Japanese were just disappointed he didn't convert to the Imperial Army, and in the end, they let him return to the ranks of the other US POWs. Not that that was a favor. With that said, however, this attitude may have just been regional and dependent on the camp. We'll never know, as there were only 2 Japanese Americans who actually served in a combat role for the US in the Pacific Theater, and the only one captured was Frank Fujita. The reason I say this attitude may have been regional, however, is that when American Navajo soldier Joe Kiyomiya was captured, the Japanese immediately labeled him as one of them, and subsequently a traitor for serving the Americans. He was subject to daily beatings and especially harsh treatment, until finally the Japanese were convinced that he was in actuality an American Indian. So this is a relatively interesting and unknown topic, and I want to know if you guys have any information on it whatsoever, maybe passed down by your grandfather or any other relative who served in the Pacific Theater. Make sure you share their stories in the comments section below. And just before you go guys, if you want to support the channel and support our niche World War I, World War II and Vietnam War content, then make sure you at least consider donating to our Patreon. Every single dollar helps, considering that our channel is blacklisted by YouTube and we're not monetized. Anyways guys, as always, thanks for watching and I hope to see you in the next video.